Nefarian's End is the final encounter in the Blackwing Descent. In this fight, you'll face off against the reanimated Nefarion and Onyxia in a 3-phase encounter. You'll want 3 tanks, 6 to 7 healers, and the rest DPS. Nefarion has a 10-minute and 30-second enrage timer. Now, I'm going to structure this guide a bit differently. The first half of this video will be the usual boss guide explanation type deal, but I'm going to omit specific details regarding the ad tanking rule for the time being, and I'm doing this for 2 reasons. Reason 1, your ad tanks will be playing a separate game from the rest of the raid, so it's not super relevant information for the majority of players. However, and reason 2, is that for the select few tanks and healers this rule does pertain to, it's without a doubt the most important and difficult rule to execute during this fight. So much so that it deserves its own segment. If you'd like to skip to that part of the video, I'll put timestamps below. But with that out of the way, let's jump into the fight. Phase 1 begins with your raid facing off against Onyxia. Have your first tank pick her up and pull her to the edge of the room. Like most dragons, she has a frontal and tail swipe, so the raid should position to her side. Then, every 20 seconds, she'll use lightning discharge, emitting electricity from her sides and hitting all players in a cone perpendicular to the direction she's facing. While she casts this ability, she can also simultaneously use her frontal or tail lash, meaning nowhere is safe. That said, tail lash is probably the least bad of the 3, so have the tank face her away from the raid during the discharge, and then turn her back once it ends. Lastly, Onyxia steadily gains energy over time, at a rate of about 1 energy every 3 seconds. If she reaches full energy, she explodes in an electrical overload, killing everyone in the raid. This is a soft enrage for the phase. DPS must kill Onyxia before she reaches 100 energy. As soon as players engage Onyxia, Nefarion uses Hail of Bones, summoning a total of 12 animated bone warriors over the next 30 seconds. Their locations are marked by purple swirlies. Have the second or ad tank pick up all 12 ads. Hunters should use misdirect to help with initial threat. Otherwise, DPS do not touch these ads. They cannot be killed with damage. Instead, they spawn with a full energy bar that steadily depletes. Only once they reach 0 energy will they collapse. Have your second tank pick them up and pull them away from the raid to the north of the room, with at least 1 dedicated healer following them and staying in range. Then, 30 seconds into the fight, Nefarion lands and joins the fray. Have the third tank establish threat and pull him to the opposite side of the room from Onyxia, facing south. This is to prevent the Children of Deathwing buff, which grants 100% increased attack speed when Nefarion and Onyxia are within 50 yards of each other. Send 2 healers with the third tank to the other side of the room, while the remaining DPS and healers focus down Onyxia. Once she reaches 30% health, all remaining players, minus the Onyxia tank and a couple healers, will run over to Nefarion to begin DPSing him down. Our goal in Phase 1 is to deal as much damage to Nefarion as possible, making later phases of the fight easier. Like Onyxia, Nefarion has a frontal and tail lash, so players must always position to one side. Nefarion's main mechanic for Phase 1 and throughout the rest of the encounter is Crackle. Every time he loses 10% health, he deals massive raid-wide nature damage. On heroic difficulty, Crackle may one-shot low stamina players. As such, it's imperative we rotate through raid defensive cooldowns for each hit of this ability. Barrier and Anti-Magic Zone are particularly strong here. Crackle also causes Onyxia to gain 25 energy. And remember, she explodes at 100 energy. This means, for most raid groups, players have enough time to push Nefarion to somewhere in the 71 to 79% health range before needing to swap back to and kill Onyxia. Exactly what this percent is will depend on your raid's DPS. During progression, I suggest rotating back to Onyxia immediately after the second Crackle. Then, as you become more comfortable with the phase, try to eke out more damage on Nefarion before swapping back. However, do not DPS Nefarion below 71%. We don't want to deal with another Crackle until Phase 3. Finally, and on heroic only, Nefarion uses Dominion. mind controlling 5 random players and granting 2 new abilities. But you lose control of your character and begin walking towards a portal. If you reach the portal, you die. Pressing the first ability, Free Your Mind, removes the mind control. All healers afflicted by Dominion must immediately use this ability. We cannot afford to lose healers at any point during this encounter. The second ability is Siphon Power, which grants a 3% damage and healing buff for 15 seconds. This ability does not have a global cooldown. DPS players will want to spam this button as much as possible, or until hitting the hard cap of 150 stacks before using Free Your Mind. To buy DPS players more time, Hunters should drop ice traps on the melee and range DPS groups. After the second crackle, players swap back to and finish off Onyxia. This triggers Phase 2. Once Onyxia has been slain, Nefarion takes to the air and fills the room with magma, leaving just 3 platforms for players to occupy during this phase. Split your raid into 3 teams. On each platform, Nefarion spawns a chromatic prototype. These adds will stand in place and cast Blast Nova, which can and must be interrupted. Each team will need 2 short kicks to cover every cast, so divide your interrupting classes among the platforms accordingly. Otherwise, during this phase, Nefarion will pelt 10 random players every 3 seconds with Shadow Flame Barrage. This deals unavoidable raid damage that your healers will need to heal through. DPS the 3 adds down, and once the final add is dead, the lava subsides and Nefarion enters Phase 3. Note that ranged DPS can reach and continue to DPS Nefarion during this phase. So, as a ranged DPS, if your platform's add dies early, you can then DPS Nefarion. But be careful not to push him below 70% health, as this causes Nefarion to cast Crackle, and with the amount of raid damage already going out during this phase, a Crackle going off will likely result in a wipe. On Heroic, during Phase 2, Nefarion will additionally target 3 random players with Explosive Cinders. This leaves a dot that explodes after 10 seconds, dealing heavy fire damage to and knocking back players within 10 yards. Players that get this debuff must therefore move away from their platform and into the lava, letting the debuff expire away from other players. Healers be sure to watch debuffed players during this time, as they'll take increasing damage the longer they spend in the lava. Additionally, on Heroic, Phase 3 now begins as soon as the first add dies. We do not want to enter Phase 3 while 1 or multiple adds are left alive. Thus, plan on killing the adds at the same time. The raid lead should call for players to stomp DPS on platforms that are further ahead than others. After 3 minutes, or once the chromatic prototypes are slain, the lava subsides and Nefarion lands shortly afterwards. If any players remain on their platforms after the lava has subsided, Nefarion will use Shadow of Cowardice, which will swiftly kill any remaining players. So be sure not to linger for long. Nefarion retains all the same abilities as he did in Phase 1, and gains the ability Shadow Blade Spark, which he casts at the location of a random Bone Warrior. This ability leaves a spreading fire on the ground. If it comes into contact with any of the adds, they reanimate with full energy. This means the adds will inevitably respawn, becoming the responsibility of the other 2 tanks, and at least 2 dedicated healers. Have your main tank pick up Nefarion, positioning him in the middle of the platform, facing east with the remainder of the raid positioned to his northernmost side. Throughout the phase, the main tank will rotate Nefarion clockwise, moving with the add tanks and healers on the perimeter of the room. The remaining raiders must also move accordingly, staying to Nefarion's side. Continue to rotate through cooldowns for Crackle and nuke Nefarion down. Death Knight save army for the tail end of the fight. At this point, the add tanks will most likely be dead, and it will buy some extra time to finish off Nefarion. Manage all of that, and that's a fight. Or at least it is for everyone that isn't involved with add tanking. For the remaining portion of the guide, I'll be discussing the add tanking role. So if this doesn't pertain to you, that's it for the guide. Thanks for watching. In Phase 1, as soon as the raid engages Onyxia, Nefarion uses Hail of Bones, summoning animated Bone Warriors over the next 30 seconds. One tank will be responsible for picking up and tanking these adds for the duration they're active. Animated Bone Warriors spawn with a full energy bar that steadily depletes until reaching 0, at which point the adds deactivate. It takes about 80 seconds for an add to fully deplete its energy bar. And while active, they gain a stacking buff in the form of empowering strikes, causing them to hit harder and move faster over time. Once the adds exhaust their energy, these stacks reset. This buff makes it so that we can't really kite the adds at high stacks of empowering strikes. Instead, tanks must rotate through their cooldowns to survive. They are susceptible to stuns, however, making Protection Warriors and Paladins strong for this role, with Shockwave and Holy Wrath functioning as an additional defensive. During progression, we had a Protection Warrior fill this role, so from here on out, I'm going to reference the Prot Warrior as the primary add tank to help distinguish them from the other tanks. Once all the adds have spawned in, your add tank will move the adds to the northernmost part of the boss arena, bringing at least one dedicated healer. Resto Druids are great for this role since they can do a lot of their healing on the move. The goal for Phase 1 is to position the adds in a good place for Phase 3, keeping them as grouped up as possible. If the adds are spread out when they run out of energy, Phase 3 becomes a lot more difficult. More on that later. Now, the reason we're specifically running to the northern part of the arena is to avoid the frontal from the southern-facing dragons. The final mechanic the adds have is that if at any point they're hit by Shadow Flame Breath, whether active or not, their energy returns to full. This spells disaster for your tank, because empowering strikes will continue to ramp, and very quickly do more damage than is survivable. Manage cooldowns correctly and avoid hitting the adds with Shadow Flame Breath, and that's the extent of the add tank role in Phase 1. In Phase 3, things get a bit more complicated. Nefarion retains all of his previous abilities and gains Shadow Blaze Spark, which leaves a patch of fire on the ground that reanimates any Bone Warriors it comes into contact with, returning them to 100 energy. Nefarion will always cast this at the location of one of the 12 Bone Warriors, regardless of whether they're active or not. This means, if we place the adds correctly in Phase 1, the first Shadow Blaze Spark should revive all 12 of the Bone Warriors at the start of the phase. And this is kind of the theme for Phase 3. We want the adds to always be in sync. This makes managing them and holding threat much easier. So, let's walk through this first set of adds. Have your add tank and one of the previous dragon tanks positioned near the deactivated adds. Now that Onyxia isn't part of the picture, they're going to help the add tank throughout the phase. In our case, we had a Feral Druid fill this role. With them, assign 2 dedicated tank healers. The main tank will position Nefarion in the center of the room with his side facing the adds. It's the main tank's responsibility to move the boss whenever the add tanks need to move. So, as an add tank, don't worry about which direction Nefarion is facing, the main tank should always adjust based on the add tank's positioning. The moment the first spark goes out and reanimates the Bone Warriors, both tanks must quickly establish threat. These adds reset threat every time they deactivate, so if left untouched, they will quickly run down your healers. After getting threat, pull the adds out of the fire, moving roughly 10 yards in a clockwise direction around the room. The fire from Shadow Blaze Spark will grow and spiral in random directions for a short while. If it comes into contact with the adds, they'll refresh their energy back to 100. This is bad, so tanks may choose to adjust and move further as needed. At this point, your tank should try to divide the adds between them, 6 adds on one tank and 6 on another. After 30 seconds, Nefarion sends out his second Shadow Blaze Spark. At 2 seconds left before this ability is used, the 2 add tanks must begin moving clockwise around the room. Shadow Blaze Spark is a projectile with travel time, so if tanks are moving with their adds at the time the projectile goes out, they can pull the adds far enough away such that we dodge the fire, and prevent the adds from regaining energy. However, backpedaling isn't fast enough. Your tanks will need to strafe run and do it in sync. If one tank is further ahead than the other, it may result in half the adds being hit by the flames and the other half dodging it outright. If your tanks manage to bait the spark away from the skeletons, they must stop moving and plant until the next spark. If your add tanks move too much, they risk running into previously placed fire. These flame patches will eventually despawn, but excess movement will result in them running out of space. Repeat this sequence for the third spark. If done correctly, after this spark, the 12 adds should have fully depleted their energy and deactivate, resetting stacks of empowering strikes. Then, by the time the fourth spark goes out, the 12 adds will reanimate and the cycle repeats once more. Tanks re-establish threat and pull the adds out of the fire. Continue planting 10 yards from the last place flame patch, and always begin moving 2 seconds before the next spark goes out. This set, however, will require a lot more movement due to the steadily decreasing Shadowblaze spark timer. If done correctly, tanks should be able to pull off one more add reset, depleting their energy for a second time. When the adds respawn for a third time, the Shadowblaze spark timer will be so short and there will be so much fire on the ground that it becomes impossible to prevent the adds from gaining energy. As a tank, the best you can do now is survive as long as possible. Hopefully, your DPS are able to kill the boss before you eventually fall over. So that's the gist of it, but here are some things to look out for. Firstly, save defensive cooldowns for moments the adds are high in stacks of empowering strikes, and for overlaps with Crackle. On Heroic, this ability hits for 130,000 nature damage every 10% taken off Nefarion's health. If not having to move for a Shadowblaze spark, a great tool here is Shockwave. Using it just before Crackle goes out enables healers to top tanks before and after the cast. Just be careful not to use it at the same time a Shadowblaze spark goes out. Secondly, tank communication is key. Things like calling out when to move for Shadowblaze spark are especially valuable. Or, if at some point the adds become desynced, such that some of them would have higher stacks of empowering strikes than others, tanks should communicate and try to divide this damage between them. Finally, as tanks are moving clockwise around the room, be mindful of the 3 pillars. Running behind them means LOSing your healers for a couple seconds, but running in front of them means moving adds closer to the raid, and potentially dropping a Shadowblaze spark in a bad location. In general, try to always move behind pillars with a cooldown up or the add stunned. Moving in front may cause the fire to spread onto the raid, which is almost a surefire way to lead to a wipe. However, a dead tank will also likely result in a wipe. So, if the tanks are out of cooldowns, ducking in front of a pillar is an option. And that's everything. Hopefully this covers most of what's necessary for the add tanking role. If you have any questions, drop a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching, and good luck in the Blackwing Descent.